If it was all super easy and there was one playbook that worked for everybody, that'd be kind of boring.
If you don't know how to be funny as a marketer going forward, it's going to be a challenge.
People are going to be the eyes and ears for the entire company of what's going on with the customer, in addition to all the massive amounts of data that AI will be processing and acting on for us.
Where the data tells a story that's got to be told. It's the art and the science, getting the numbers right. Brand Formance!
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Brand Formance podcast. Today, I'm joined by Carolyn Pollock, who's a retail and e-commerce marketing leader. She is best known for serving as the CMO of Tailored Brands that included Men's Warehouse and Jose Bank. And she brings 20 plus years of brand, commerce, and performance marketing leadership across retail, marketplaces, and CPG, working at companies like Thumbtack, eBay, Timbuktu, and many others, with a track record in brand reinvention, omnichannel growth, and rigorous measurement. So let's dive in. Welcome to this podcast. And before I even get into the meat of the conversation today, I want to start with a very simple question. What is one brand whose marketing you are jealous of right now?
Oh, geez. Let me think about it. I know that's always such a great question. I have to say, trying to think, do I go with like the obvious ones? But
Obvious is okay. Hey, whatever's top of mind.
well, there's so many, but I wouldn't say there's anybody I'm jealous of right now. I think I really empathize with the challenge that marketers are faced with right now across so many different aspects, right? So you think of like, take a traditional play like what American Eagle tried to do, right? Where it's just like, get a great well-known celebrity, get great looking creative, have a media plan that really blankets the customer across multiple channels. Like all that should really work. And, you think you've got something that's pretty safe because this is like a super popular celebrity, and then something just backfires. And in the end, like you hear them talk now, like, their sales and performance have been actually very strong through all the firestorm, but still nobody wants to have to go through that. So I can't say I'm jealous of that. And I empathize with what, Craig and his team had to go through there. And then I look at, brands that like Nike, who's always been held up as like the epitome of amazing brand marketing, who kind of lost their way and actually lost their brand marketing storytelling, and now is like working super hard to try and find a way back to that. But then, there's just all the new technology and everything that's changing dramatically how marketers use it, and whether they use it authentically and whether they use it in a way that actually helps their brands. So I just think it's actually a real challenge right now. I don't think there's anybody that's standing out as like they are nailing it in all aspects, because it's very hard right now to nail it in all aspects, whether that's the brand story itself, whether it's the media in which you're executing, whether it's the technology you're leveraging to execute that work, the way you're measuring it, like all of it is faced with unprecedented challenges right now. So I think it's actually a fascinating time to be a marketer, because if it was all super easy and there was one playbook that worked for everybody, that'd be kind of boring.
I say this often, we'd all be sipping pina coladas at the beach, right? If it was that easy. No, I love that answer. And actually, I was thinking about it. As a startup founder, you kind of have to be both very optimistic and also sometimes very realistic about sort of what's going on. And I feel the same way about sort of all the change that's happening in marketing, right? I feel there's a sense of optimism that there's let's go back the fundamentals and the basics a little bit of what makes good marketing. At the same time, there's just so much change every day, every week, and it's hard to keep up. So
yeah.
Okay. So
Which makes it fun.
which makes it fun. I couldn't agree more. So I want to talk about your experience at Tailored Brands. You joined the brand right out of bankruptcy, right?
Before.
Oh, before. Interesting. Okay. And then you went on a
arguing.
Yeah. Tell me the whole thing. Like, how did it go down? What's the behind the scenes? And, re-emerging as a private equity owned company. And then I read a bunch about sort of the turnaround that you and the leadership there led. And tell me about sort of what led to that turnaround. What were the key ingredients? Let's dive into it.
Yeah. So I was originally, I had a marketing consulting business, and my business partner and I were brought into Tailored Brands to look at the brand strategies of Men's Warehouse and Jose Bank, who are the two primary brands in their portfolio. They have a brand in Canada called Moores and another brand called K&G, which is, Moores is mostly in Canada. K&G is mostly a regional brand in the South and Eastern area. And, so we started doing that, but as we were working on that brand strategy for those two businesses, started looking at the marketing playbook that was being used. And this was back in 2019. And at the time, it was still a very traditional, heavy offline media plan. And it's talk about brands losing their way. The story that was being put out there almost consistently in every piece of creative was only about price and discounts, and therefore the brands themselves had kind of lost their way as well. So there was a serious need to kind of modernize and refresh the way the brands showed up to the customer, the where they showed up to the customer, and quite frankly, the backbone and infrastructure that they used to show up to the customer. So, a marketing transformation was needed anyways, and that's why I joined. Was that I really believed that there was a pretty clear line of sight to a number of like fundamental changes that could really improve the business. But at the same time, the business was struggling a little bit with some outsized debt, and then COVID happened, which is sort of like the double whammy, which then forced closures of all the stores for a quarter. And I actually joined February 1st of 2020 as an employee.
Wow.
So thankfully, I'd had almost 2 years of time with the business at that point where I knew the business, I knew the people. It made navigating what we had to face then much better, but it was still a crazy challenge. So we were then closed for a quarter. And obviously through that, the pressure on the balance sheet got even stronger. And, really the best path for the company's longer term success was to declare Chapter 11, which, I never want to have to go through again. But the experience was incredible from the standpoint of, marketers don't always love to dig line by line into everything and understand like where everything is, what's costing, what's performing, that sort of like forensic analysis of everything that's happening in your budget and in the market. And we had to do that just by nature of the bankruptcy. So it instilled a discipline in the team and a real rigor in all of us around, consciously being very careful about where every dollar was spent. But not so much so that we weren't willing to try things and invest in things. So basically what the emergence from Chapter 11 enabled us to do, and we did that in record time. Like it was a very quick process to go in and out. And we had investors who really believed in the potential and the future of the company. We just needed that protection to help us navigate the time that we were in. We came out of it, though, with this discipline around cost structure and rigor around the analysis of where the dollar was being spent, but also with an eye to the need for innovation and for trying new things and learning from that. And, so I've built almost like a scrappy startup mentality within this, 50 plus year old organization. And it enabled us to really start to accelerate the way we were going to market, trying new channels, particularly in the world of social media. And it brought us to a place where we were able to deliver brands that were far more elevated in their perception, that had a story to tell about why they were there for the customer. It enabled us to go to market in media channels that were far more efficient and effective, and sort of finding the right combinations of those media channels that worked well. And it enabled us to start to invest in building an infrastructure that allows us to now start to capitalize on the technologies that are coming to bear through AI as well. So in a way, as hard as it was, the Chapter 11 experience, and sort of the subsequent 3 plus almost 4 years after coming out of that I led the team through, really positioned the company far, far better than it ever could have been otherwise.
Got it. This is very interesting. And there's a lot of different threads that we can pull on. There's the forensic analysis and understand the cost structure and the data-driven sort of approach. There's the trying new things and, really elevating the brand. Let's start there maybe, because I think that's always the hardest part, right? The creative, the brand, the perception, the shaping, the mental perception that customers have. What were the big things that you tried and things that worked and things that didn't work? Were there sort of big themes, or was it just like, hey, we just tried everything? And I'm curious how you even put the strategy and the structure in place for testing things.
Yeah, well, and that's like one of the keys, right? Is like putting into place this discipline and mindset that like we need to be data driven in our decision making, and we should try a whole bunch of things, but we should know definitively whether it works or not, and do the testing that's required for that. And quite frankly, like some of the testing that we did maybe wasn't even constructed properly, right? Like we didn't allow for enough time for the test to run to get a really clear, significant enough read that everybody had confidence in the data. That was one example where, that was good learning. We maybe didn't constrain enough the variables within which we were testing. So we were trying to test too many changes at once. But as we learned over time, we started to learn that, and we made our testing more effective, and we got more confidence in the results from that. That made a huge difference. The other thing was around like the messaging itself, right? And what was right. And I think that came about with like just a reshift in the way we think about what really matters to our customer and where they were in their shopping journey and what was happening in the world around us as well. And, the company had fallen into this habit of discount, discount, discount. And it's a challenge that a lot of retailers face, where like the only way to get ahead or to comp last year better is to offer a lower price. And don't worry, we'll quote, make it up in volume, which is like the kiss of death from a brand standpoint. And so, again, like the reset that happened through COVID and the fact that literally we sold suits to people who worked in the office or were getting married, and neither of which were happening for a chunk of time. We had to find a way to show up to the customer in a way that was far more relevant. And so coming out of COVID, it was like really, again, listening to the customer. Where were they at? People just in the world were craving connection again, right? They were craving getting back together with one another in real life, in person. And, we wanted to show that we understood that and could be there for them in those moments. So looked at a far more kind of emotionally driven campaign that tapped into the joy of celebrating somebody getting married, or the joy of getting together in a backyard with a bunch of friends and, shedding the sweats that one had been wearing throughout the whole, Zoom world, and putting on a cool sport jacket and a great pair of jeans, or, whatever it was that like we tapped into much more about that wasn't sort of leading with price. We still could use price as a call to action, or if we were doing the inevitable weekend sale or whatever, we would use that as sort of like the urgency or the reason to act now, but that wouldn't be the story. And we reclaimed the storytelling that needed to happen, and that storytelling centered around the customer and where the customer was at.
Got it. I also, read about an article that was emphasizing how you leaned back into humor, and some of the ads that I came across. Was that part of the story before, from the 2010s or 2000s, or was that a completely new sort of thing that you had to take the brand through?
It was totally new. So the brand had never really played with humor. I mean, the brand was extraordinarily well known. This is the Men's Warehouse brand.
Yeah.
Extremely well known for George Zimmer, who was the founder and CEO for a very long time. A lot of money in a very consistent, sort of storybook media plan in terms of like heavy, consistent weight over many, many years, led everybody to really know Men's Warehouse for this one line: "You're going to like the way you look, I guarantee it." There's nothing really that funny about that, right? But what we wanted to do was turn it into sort of some emotion, and the idea that if you actually love the way you look, what does that unlock? And it just sort of takes it a little bit more to the extreme. And the introduction of humor was a way for us to break through and shake up people's perceptions, basically, of Men's Warehouse. That if Men's Warehouse had never been known to kind of tell a funny joke or put a customer in a funny situation or whatever, like, does this get people to kind of jostle their perception a little and think differently about the brand? And we felt that humor was a great way to build that connection with the customer, get their attention, and get them thinking differently about the brand. And it's worked really, really well. I mean, we found that brand awareness has always been something that Men's Warehouse has enjoyed a very high level of, but the consideration had always been the challenge. And we started to see consideration move pretty significantly, particularly among kind of our core target audience of, men in that, like, getting into their career, starting and working in the office, getting married, like all these moments that guys need to kind of dress up for a little bit more. That audience, we moved the needle on consideration pretty significantly.
How did you measure consideration, Carolyn? Like, did you have a rolling sort of tracker? Did you do things differently? Like, what was your methodology?
Yeah, that was one of the things that I changed reasonably early on, was that we were using a very traditional brand tracking mechanism that was quarterly. It was like a 25, 30-minute survey that would just like bludgeon the poor recipient, the poor survey taker. And, we get that information in a like very in-depth report that very few people digested. And that information will come months after the time that it was received, and it was just a very sort of dated way to go about things. And I had experience with a client, it was a large technology company that was very focused on trust and understanding trust in the company, trust in the brand, trust in their CEO. And we had leveraged while I was there a polling technology that electoral candidates use to understand kind of where they stand, and that's a very quick read, right? And it's a very snapshot of a point in time. And I felt like that might be a more modern way to approach how you think about a brand as well. And the brand spend was such that we had enough dollars in market and enough impressions that we could start to track that. Less so of like, what does any one given week tell us, but more over time, what's happening. And as we're instituting these massive changes in messaging and all that, like, what does that do to people's perception? So we worked with a large research organization that does like very mass panel data, and they work with governments and banks and all that to measure consumer sentiment. And they now work with brands as well, such that we were able to start now getting weekly reads on very key attributes around the brand and awareness, consideration, et cetera.
Okay, so you went on this massive sort of transformation, right, of the brand, and you mentioned a couple of things. You went from offline to sort of, more digital, and that was, you evolved the messaging to be more emotional, and leading with humor in some areas, and you were able to move the consideration. How did you all track, to your point, and going back to sort of that forensic analysis? How do you sort of stay on top of, okay, we're seeing great movements and consideration. How does that show up on the P&L?
Yeah.
And I'm curious sort of, what were leading metrics and, lagging metrics that you were looking at to be able to tie it back? Because again, I think this was a private equity owned company, and I'm sure the CFO was very sort of, in fine tuned on the numbers. So I'm curious what that dynamic was like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So couple of things. So the tracker obviously was a key input. The other thing that had not been in place was any kind of holistic measurement of marketing. So the only data that the teams were using really were, okay, we put a bunch of TV on the air this weekend and we ran it from Wednesday to Sunday and we did it at this weight, and what happened to sales? And then the next weekend we did it this other weight, what happened to sales? And that was like assuming the sales were equivalent, the inventory in the stores was the same. There wasn't like, thunder and lightning happening in front of a whole bunch of stores that, just assumed that everything else was constant, which it wasn't. So it was very difficult to kind of get that read. So one thing we started was instituting match market testing, where we would make changes in different markets that were similar in terms of size of stores and penetration of stores and that kind of thing. And we would change media weight, for example. So we would get a bit of visibility into the impact of more TV, less TV, and in some cases even no TV. And then in some cases layered on with social media. Or so we would play with different combinations of the channels and do these match market tests to be able to understand, what combinations drove what results. And that was one of the ones where, initially we didn't run those for long enough. And we learned that like you have to run those for a longer period of time to really get the clear reads. So we started to do that. And that was an amazing input, but that was just one data input. The second was, what's happening in the platforms and what each of the digital platforms tell us in those. But, those are not necessarily incremental in terms of the reads. We also did A/B tests around that. So like, putting less money into branded search versus more money into branded search and, those types of things, turning things on and off and determining kind of what happened across different geographies. And then the last thing we did was we played with a couple different approaches to this, but we ended up with a media mix model that we built. The final one that we're still now using is one that was kind of really built for retailers. And it does a combination of kind of traditional media mix modeling with some multi-touch attribution capabilities so that we could actually get weekly reads on what was happening in the market. And as we made adjustments to channels and that kind of thing. So all of those together would start to give us a better sense of total marketing ROI across all channels. And then specifically within channels, what was happening, even down to kind of the customer type. So whether it was a new customer, existing customer, that kind of thing. We then married that with that brand tracking that we were getting on a weekly basis so that we could look at, okay, on this week where consideration increased by 2 points, what were we doing in our media mix at that time? Were we spending more in upper funnel? What did that do to our ROI? And we could start to get a read of kind of how the whole combination worked together. The thing I just would emphasize again was like looking at any one weekend snapshot tended to not give us an accurate reality check on what was going on. That like what was far more beneficial was trends over time. And as you know, we got patient with, okay, we did this and we did this and we did this, and then what was the end result after kind of consistently running something for 3 weeks or whatever? Did we start to see some true trend changes happen? But that marriage of the two started to become a really powerful thing for us to be able to tap into.
Got it. That's all. It makes complete sense in how you went about it. One of the things that I personally believe is incredibly hard to do is measure the long-term effect of any type of marketing, right? Some people will isolate this conversation just to brand marketing. And what is brand marketing? Maybe it's, upper funnel or reach focused marketing, whatever you want to call it, whatever semantics we want to use. But there's some marketing that you have a great TV ad or a great YouTube ad and it's, goes viral and it stays in your memory for years.
Yeah.
And, I think about this, about the Dollar Shave Club, video. I don't know if you've seen that one, right? Or there's some Cadbury's ads from, my childhood that are still in my head, right? And so when you do this awareness tracking, when you do this MMM and testing, that's all sort of very short-term focused. As that's the design of any of these methodologies. And yes, you can look at it over time to understand sort of the longer term. But I'm curious if that was ever a conversation within the business between, your own sort of mental dialogue of like, hey, are we just optimizing for the short term? And
right.
And maybe that's okay, but like, how do you balance that with some of that longer term thinking? And how do you really think big and beyond just what the spreadsheets are telling you?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's critical too for in the men's tailored clothing business where your purchase cycle is very long, right? So people are not buying suits every week. So getting a read week over week isn't going to help you when the frequency is not like, your Starbucks and, people are coming to get coffee every day or whatever. So, so that like that long-term lens and the value of acquiring a customer today versus planting the seed with the customer because they're not currently in market, but that when they become in market, you're top of mind for that. It is super important. So yeah, there were a few different things. So the firm that helped us with the mix model also looked at kind of longer term customer value, and they had sort of a predictive component to it that would look at that. That was also why consideration was such an important measure for us, because consideration was like the nature of the question was such that like, are you considering purchasing a suit in the next year? And if so, what brands would you consider, kind of thing? So it was not like looking at, did you purchase? Are you going to purchase today? That type of measure. It was much more of like, is this now something that you would think about down the road, kind of thing? And attaching a value to that and describing that is also a really important measure to be looking at, because that was really the problem with the brands, was that like that awareness, but like people weren't considering it, which is just sort of the kicker for brand health,
Got it. And I would also imagine that some things are just not measurable. Did you ever have that conversation? It's like, hey, yeah, it's a great question, CFO, or whoever. We're just not going to talk about it because it's not possible to do.
I don't.
Or maybe you can push back on me and say like, no, everything is possible to be measured.
I don't know if everything's possible to be measured. Certainly, I don't think everything's possible to be measured in a way that everybody believes in it. And if you've got like, real numbers focused people, like they're only going to want the stuff that's like tried and true. There have been like, 15 HBS studies about, and, everybody really understands kind of the value of it. What I do think you can look at are things that like I sort of call like the proxies, right? So what are the things that like are indicators of interest by the customer, engagement in the brand, talk value, so there are other measures that you can put in place to understand, like, are we actually just becoming more part of culture again? Are we becoming more part of the conversation? Are we being, when there's a roundup around men's clothing, are we being talked about? Like when, people are getting advice for weddings and how to outfit the groom, like, are we getting mentioned? And how much of this stuff is happening organically versus how much do we have to push it through our own efforts. And so we would look at those types of things too. And we describe a quote value to it. We didn't put numbers behind that as much, but there was a belief that there was value in that, and that was an important thing to track as well. Now, none of that mattered if you weren't delivering the ROI on the short term pieces. And, you could only really get the license to have those kinds of conversations with the CFO once you were able to show, listen, I already made this change. We went from like a 3x return to a 4x return or a 5x return. Know that part of it is being handled now. Now we want to think about the longer term and how we can manage that.
You brought up the CFO conversation. Was it easy or hard for the CFO to get on board with this new way of measurement?
This is like advice I would give everybody that I learned definitely over the course of it, was like, you can't involve your finance partners enough. So like the more that you engage them and have them feel like they're part of the design and the inputs into the development of a model or the analysis and interpretation of the results, like that is so critical, because then they're in there with you, and together you feel a sense of ownership over the results and the performance of it. So I think like, looking at them as your partner, and that you all ultimately are working towards the same goal is critical. And I think too often marketing leaders tend to think of it as sort of this adversarial relationship where all the CFO ever does is take money from me. But like the CFO actually wants that every dollar in the company to be spent productively. He can show that, spending $1 on marketing is more effective than spending $1 on, another truck for delivery or whatever. Like then it's worthwhile.
Yeah, it's a great point, and something we try to get our prospects and customers to do as well, even within the sales conversation. Like, hey, get the CFO involved, because if you're going to buy this really expensive piece of, software and service to go build these MMMs and testing, but if your CFO doesn't buy them, you just wasted your time, the vendor's time, and your CFO's time.
Yeah, exactly. When we conducted RFPs for the media mix model, the CFO was our SVP of finance were key stakeholders in that.
Makes total sense. Now, one of the things you've also, we started the podcast with this. There's a lot of change that's happening in the market right now, right? I don't know if you followed all the news from OpenAI in the last couple of weeks, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's Sora 2, the new mobile app, which in my opinion is going to become a flagship social media app in the next 12 months. It's going to do really, really well, is my opinion. Sam Altman has now come out and said, he's much more open to ads.
Yep.
They have a new Pulse feature, which is like a daily reminder of all the things that you should be doing on. I can totally imagine that becoming a feed for ads. Mm-hmm. They probably won't put it in ChatGPT because they want it to be very true and be unbiased, but
maybe. I would start thinking now, like, as I would advise all brands to think, if there were ads in ChatGPT, what would it look like, and how do I take advantage of that? Because I mean, I think even honestly, in the way we're all talking about AEO and what that looks like, that's going to get monetized at some point. I'm certain, So.
No, the meta point that I was thinking about I feel like the pace of change is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's very high, and it's getting higher, right? You have new ad formats, you have new algorithm changes, you have new platforms emerging at a faster rate in the 2020s than we had in the 2000s or the 2010s.
Totally.
And one of the things that you've talked about is getting the data foundation right to be able to be in a position that you can adapt to these changes. What do those data foundations look like from your perspective? What are the things that you would, advise the CMO who's at a high, pace, fast scaling business, trying to do all these things, but maybe struggling a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest advantage is having that confidence in your data. And one of the things that a lot of in the world of retail, retailers are faced with so much data, but it's all coming from very disparate sources, and there's no harmonization of that. But if you dig in and invest in the work that requires to do, so that you can build kind of what we call the customer 360, where you really were able to get a picture of the customer from all these different data points, and you had sort of a common identifier for that customer, with identity rationalization and all that kind of stuff. That is so critical, because then you can act on that. Then you can like use that information to say, okay, I know these customers are in X, Y, and Z channels, and these are the key actions that they take in those channels, and I can now deliver this type of creative for them in these different types of places. Like that is just, it's so important. So having that sort of upfront work done around harmonizing your data and creating sort of these single sources of truth is just so critical.
The interesting thing is hearing you talk about this, because before Tailored Brands, you've done some interesting things, right? You were at eBay, you were at Thumbtack, you were, also at Unilever and Timbuktu. So like both tech brands and consumer brands. Did you feel like you had this appreciation for data and this data sort of way of doing things earlier in your career? Or was that something that you kind of learned as you went through these brands, and especially the technology brands? I'm curious how you came to the current sort of way of thinking.
I mean, I think so. First off, my actual undergrad is in genetics, so like
There we go. Yes, I remember
with
that.
science degree, like I think the numbers have always mattered. It had to do labs, and like I had to roll on the data in the labs and all that. So, and then I started my career in market research, and so similarly, that orientation. But honestly, then my first kind of real job in North America was with Unilever, and every single project that we did, we had to create a brief for that included an estimate around the ROI. So there was this requirement to dig into the numbers and the results as best as we could. And then like God, there are like very little tools available to us to actually do that. And I remember that the best source of data we had were the Nielsen scan data reports from grocery stores on UPC scans. And even then it was like, well, that's only really we think 75 to 80% of our sales, and so you had to like apply these factors and all that. But that rigor and that discipline around the numbers, I think, was instilled in me pretty early on. And then at eBay, like suddenly you're in this place where all the data actually is coming from primarily a single source, which was the site, and it was all digital. And so like the ability to harness that was that much greater. It was still massive amounts, and it was very complicated because it came from all these different types of products and categories and that kind of thing. But still, there was just so much more data there that was at our disposal. And that, if you had a question, quite frequently your question could get answered in some way with the data.
Right.
So I think just the power of it was like really reinforced to me through that experience. And as such, I think like continue to kind of respect that as we go, but also like the way that can give you a window into the customer is just so powerful. The one thing I'll say though is that like never should you, and I think this will be even more important as we go through AI, where like even more data and signals and all that will come. Like at the end of the day, you still need to talk to your customers, and you still need to find those moments to interact with your customer face to face and hear directly from them. These days, maybe it's through comments on social media or Reddit or whatever, but as much as you can, like be ready for those qualitative inputs as well, and balance those with the quantitative data inputs.
Every time I think about that, I remember the Sam Walton story, right? That he would just go to the stores and walk around and look at what's going on in the store, even when he was at the peak of, his career.
Yeah.
And there's no replacement for that sort of just, very tangible, physical conversation with your audience rather than just reading comments online, right? Because that's like such a narrow way of looking at the world.
Yeah, and it's one way, and you're not like having that dialogue. And one of the things that I always talk about is like a brand, having a customer relationship. Like we talk about even CRM is customer relationship management. However, most CRM is like you spamming the customer with a ton of things that you want to talk about through email and text. And there's no way for the customer to dialogue with you back. It is like, it's not actually a relationship. And for you to find those ways to have that relationship is, critical for a brand to be healthy. And if you think about like a true relationship that you have in the human world, there's back and forth and there's emotion involved and there's dialogue, and you've got to find ways to do that with your brand so that you can actually build that same kind of connection with your customer.
I love that idea. And I'm also thinking about our own sort of marketing efforts. And, we do a newsletter every 2 weeks. It's a very personal newsletter. It comes from me with, things that's going on and things that are going on in our sort of world. But now that you've made me think about this, I think every email should have some type of an interactive element to it, which means the audience can actually do something with it and get some value out of it. Because if you make it that way, right, you make it a dialogue, it becomes so much more powerful.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Going forward, we talk about AI. And one of the things that I think about is, what is the marketing team and the CMO of the future going to look like?
Mm.
So if we fast forward 5 years, right, we're talking about agents, we're talking about much more efficient creative production. You can argue if the quality, what will happen to the quality, but like, at least from an efficiency standpoint, there are gains. I'm curious, if you were, trying to play a prediction game 5 years out, what do you think it will look like?
I know it's such a hot question these days, and I don't know if we all know yet, because you think that it's going to go this one way, and then some new innovation comes out, and like, oh well, that's changing, and so I don't know if that we have a clear answer yet, but I do keep coming back to kind of like what I was saying around that relationship with the customer, that you can have all the data in the world if it's one way and you don't have the opportunity to like actually talk to the customer and see the customer interact with your product and interact with you as a brand, and go through an experience. I think you're missing part of it. And so I think having the human element in the team is going to be really critical, from that, like bringing back the customer to the center. And so I think the AI is going to be amazing at obviously automating all the day-to-day kind of more mundane rote tasks and all that. And certainly is even going to, as we've seen with Sora and all that, like going to do a lot of the creative work as well. But like at the end of the day, like it's all based on what's happened in the past. All of the AI capabilities are based on pattern recognition from past data. So it's not going to be thinking kind of net new of like what could be, to the same extent that a human can. And so I think like the innovative thinking, the creative thinking, the empathetic thinking, the like connecting to the customer and listening to the customer, like there's so many kind of more like true human behavioral things that I think we're going to look for in marketers going forward. And I think those people are going to be the eyes and ears for the entire company of what's going on with the customer, in addition to all the massive amounts of data that AI will be processing and acting on for us. So I think like it will certainly be smaller teams. I think there will be, a lot more marketing that will be automated than there is today. But I think there's still going to be, strategic thinking and innovative thinking that is going to need to come from people. And so I think it's how we train the marketers of tomorrow to be able to be those people is, I think, the thing that we all have to be thinking about today.
I feel like I have the same opinion as you do. And when I think about the skill sets for those future marketers, right? So something that you said is like, and your background is really interesting, right? So you came from a field of science. I actually think that scientific thinking is going to have to be adopted a lot more in marketing. And that doesn't mean that it's, science people becoming marketers. It just means that if you are going into the field of marketing, you have to understand the science of marketing. And that's going to become a key skill set. The second one is, I think, market research. And I think you got a leg up by doing that early in your career, and being able to talk to human beings, knowing what is a leading question, what is not a leading question, how do you construct surveys, how do you construct focus groups and what have you to get the true human insight. That I think becomes really interesting. Although there are some people now who are arguing that, hey, you can just do this synthetically through AI. I'm like, I don't know. And then I think the third piece, which I think is maybe getting recognized, is how to be funny. That is going to be a skill set. Like, I think if you don't know how to be funny as a marketer going forward, it's going to be a challenge. Because at the end of the day, we all just want, maybe this is just like how dysfunctional we all are as a race. We just want to be in front of a screen and be entertained. So that's my take on what I think skill sets are going to evolve to, is understanding the science, understanding how to do research, and then understanding how to make things funny. And I could be wrong, but like, I don't know if you have a take on any of those.
Yeah, I mean, I'm relatively aligned with that. I think, marketing has always been about art and science, and I think that's going to be even more true. It's just that the science piece is almost going to be kind of taken care of in a lot of ways. And I think instead, the science piece for a human marketer is going to be about critical thinking. Don't just take the dumb numbers for face value, like which is true today, but I think even more so as we go forward. Critical thinking, sort of innovative thinking about the what if. Like, one of the things I love that I learned when I was in science and I started having to do a lot more math was how math started to become far more artistic the deeper you went into it, and far more creative. And like the last thing you think of is math as being, creative in any way, but it actually is. Like when you get into like the theories and all of that, like it's very creative. And there's this very much a like kind of what if kind of thinking that happens in math. And I think that's true. It's also true in science. And I think that's also going to be even more true in marketing, is that like that innovative thinking is going to be just, that the skill that gets rewarded a lot. And then last, I think what you're saying about funny is true, but I would push that to be kind of almost any emotion. And that goes back to like sure having that relationship with the customer. Like if you can create intrigue and suspense and, fear is not typically a successful marketing tactic, but like it could be, I guess. But just like that storytelling and storytelling that's rooted in emotion. I think, I know AI is going to get to a place where it can mimic emotion. I have to believe in some way, like it's not going to feel the same way necessarily, unless people kind of kid themselves to think that it is real, genuine emotion. So I think like being able to tap the emotion of others through your storytelling is going to be a skill set that is even more.
I have a theory on this, Carolyn. I think the next generation, the generation that's like, whatever, 10 years old right now, when they get to 15, 16, 20, they're going to be able to tell AI apart from non-AI better than us.
Yeah.
Because they have grown up in that environment where they know what's real and what's fake real.
Yeah.
And, this is kind of like you remember the millennial pause where when you and I maybe do a TikTok video, we have this like short pause right before. And that's seen as a taboo by these younger ones because they're like, no, you're doing it wrong. That's not how you use TikTok. And I think it's the same thing that's going to happen is like there are going to be tells that humans figure out that, that's fake shit. Like that's not real.
Yeah. I think that's probably true.
Such an interesting time. Okay. We always end with this question. I think we've covered so much ground and your science background is going to be fantastic for this question. So if you could absolutely run any marketing experiment that you wanted to, what would it be and why?
Oh man. Oh God, there's so many. I think I'd want to understand, one of the things that is so interesting to me, like around personalization is that, it's one thing to personalize around something we know somebody bought or that we know, somebody has indicated interest in, they've browsed or whatever. But if you didn't have that information, like what level of personalization is meaningful and at what point is it just extra work, So I think like something around taking a core message and going out and kind of seeing like to what depth of personalization it drives value versus at what point it's just like iterations and versions that aren't necessary, I think is interesting because we're going to very quickly get to a point where you could do 10,000 iterations of something very easily because AI will make that possible. But do you need to? And does that in any way dilute your core message? Such that like that long-term effect that you're looking for gets lost. So that would be, I don't even know how you design that experiment. And, it would be like a massive thing to kind of undertake. But I think that's something that we keep striving for this goal of like better personalization or like to what end, like, and to how much should we go versus, keeping really core to this is who we are and this is what we mean. And the people who resonate with that are the people that are our people kind of thing.
Okay, that's a great one. I actually remember reading about this, or maybe I heard about it on another podcast. In the early days when Amazon was just books, they had a human team that would do recommendations to anybody who was buying a book and saying, hey, here's what else you could buy, right? It was all human-led. And over the course of time, that became an algorithm and a machine that would do those recommendations. And for a very long time, the humans were better than the machine was. But at a certain scale, the machine got better than the humans.
Right. Yeah.
And the way that they were measuring that specific thing was very simple. It was just, sales. So something that you could construct holdout groups on and so on and so forth. But to your point, right, it's can you apply that same thing to whatever you're doing, which is start with a human being in terms of recommendations and see if you can get the machine to beat it. And you're essentially measuring sales at the end of it. And, it's not that hard to construct this test, but I completely agree with you. 90% of personalization is meaningless.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is our attention spans for email, for in-app, for SMS is very, very short.
Yeah.
And as long as you hit on the core message, that's probably enough.
Yeah.
But the challenge is if you're selling something that is quite different for multiple subsegments, and that's where it becomes challenging. And then, I have a friend who's a founder of a company that says like everything's going to be perfectly personalized, and I can also buy into that, which is like, hey, it would be nice if the computer just knew all of my preferences, but it's hard to know if that's if that's ever going to happen because the data is never that clean.
Well, and sorry, with that, just one thing that I always, this is like, I've always debated this with people around algorithms and all that is, again, it's based on past data and past performance and past behaviors. Where's my inspiration? Where's the thing that I never would have dreamed that I would have wanted this, but I actually totally want that, like that is exactly
Discovery, right?
like,
And
how does,
hide out in the heart.
Mhm.
And I have a personal story around this. I was a Uniqlo buyer for like a good 7-8 years. And then one day I made my mind that I'm not going to buy from Uniqlo again. Sorry, Uniqlo. Mostly because their quality had gone down. So I was, buying shirts that would just fade very quickly or get, whatever would happen. And I have, now it's been like a year that I haven't found my go-to brand yet. And I'm in a complete discovery mode.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying a whole bunch of stuff out. And there's no recommendation engine that would look at my historicals and say, this is what would work for you. So to your point, not as simple as saying your preferences, because preferences are dynamic.
Yeah.
So great point. All right. This has been a fascinating conversation. Carolyn, thank you so much. What are you up to now? Do you consult? Do you write? How do people connect with you? What is there anything you want to promote? Tell us about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, I'm currently in the search for a new CMO role because I'm looking to kind of bring the same level of transformation to another organization who's, got a little goodness in their brand, but it needs a bit of a kick in the pants in some way. So, and I think like now is, like I said earlier, just such a fascinating time that there's so much opportunity for change. It's figuring out the right way to go about it and all that. So that's really my primary focus. I'm, doing a little bit of work here and there just because I'm wanting to stay very active in what's happening in marketing right now. But yeah, that's the focus. So
All right.
on LinkedIn, happy to connect with people and yeah.
Fantastic. I'm sure the next brand would love to and would be lucky to have you. And wishing you the best. And thanks again for doing this. It was super fun.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks, Pranav.
All right, folks, that was Carolyn Pollock. As you heard on today's podcast, she is a wealth of information. So go connect with her on LinkedIn, check out her online writings, and tune in again next week for another episode of Brand Formats.